All righty, and welcome back. Thank you. It is always nice when people show back up again after the first one. First one, they don't know what they're going to get. The second one, they came anyway, so it always makes me feel good about myself as well, so thank you for that. We will be going through to lunch in this session, and I do know when lunch is happening, and I have a countdown clock here, so don't worry about it. We'll get there. All righty. One thing I forgot to mention in the first session, simply because the first session, trying to get all of that in, I know it's a longer one, this will be a shorter session, something to catch up with. People have asked me, and I was asked again during the break, so how do you define small? Because I didn't define small for you. First of all, when I started this ministry just over 10 years ago, we really debated what to call it. Do we call it small church? And we came up with a whole other list of things to call it, normal size, family size, fun size, micro church. We had all kinds of different names. And I stuck with small because, one, while it requires some explanation, it requires less than all of the other terms. And secondly, if we think there's nothing wrong with being small, then we can't be afraid to use the word small. If small is not an insult, then it's fine to use the word, and it's not. So I know that there are large ministries. I was on a podcast once with a very large ministry, and they were talking about it. In our ministry, we call it the S word. You're not allowed to use the S word. You're not allowed to say small church. And I thanked them because I said, from your perspective, I understand that, because from your perspective, that's the way it is. But from my perspective, we embrace it as a name. So what does it mean when I say small? What do I mean by small? Well, 10 years ago when I wrote The Grasshopper Myth, I defined it one way. 5 years ago when I wrote my follow-up book, The Small Church Essentials, I defined it a different way, slightly better. Today I define it even a better way than I defined it then, which means 5 years from now I'll have a better definition than this, but this is my best one at the moment. There are two very distinct types of small churches. There's the church of 50, give or take 50. And there's a church of 150, give or take 50. Those are two very different types of small churches. Now I know if you're in a church of 50, give or take, especially if you're in a church of 50 take, you just did the quick arithmetic in your head and you went, so a church of 200 is considered small? That may be bigger than the biggest church in your town. I get it. There's a big difference there. But the reason I call them both small is this. While a church of 50, give or take, and a church of 150, give or take, have a lot of differences in the way they're pastored, they have more similarities than they have differences. And here's why. Once you hit 200 or so, things shift. It's the biggest shift in pastoral leadership that there is for size. And here's why. God knows everyone and is everywhere. And you're not him. So I'm doing this based on pastoral capacity. A church of 50, give or take 50, the pastor can know everyone and be at every event pretty much. It's constant pastoral presence. In a church of 150, give or take, the pastor is there, can know all of the regulars and is there for all of the main events that aren't like age specific or gender specific and so on. So in both of those types of churches, there is a regular pastoral presence and a regular pastoral hands-on pastoring that happens. But once you get above 200 or so, the pastor then has to delegate most of the hands-on pastoring to other people because physical capacity. We're not God. We can't be at all places for all people when it gets that big. So that's my definition of small and why we lay it out that way so that as we go forward, you have some understanding of that. So we'll set that aside for now. Remind you again, you can get all the notes at karlvaters.com/Indiana Church of God, INCOG 23. But before I go to the first point, let me tell you a little bit of a story. There is an unincorporated township just about 100 miles south of here named Kurtz, Indiana. I know this because several years ago, I was scheduled to speak at a conference in Kurtz, Indiana. I flew into Indianapolis, I got in the car, I plugged in the address and didn't think about it and just kept driving. And after a while, I realized I've been driving a long time and I've seen nothing. And I was like 10 minutes from it and I still don't see anything ahead. And about 5 minutes ahead, and I still don't see anything ahead. About 3 minutes up, I see a wide spot on the road. It looks like about the size of a rest area. But there's a tiny little spire, and I go, it can't be, can it? Sure enough, I pull into Kurt's Nazarene Church in Kurtz, Indiana. And I look around, and I don't see another church in town. I don't see a store. I don't see a gas station. I look it up. It's an unincorporated township, which means it legally doesn't exist. And we have a great conference, and at the end of it, I asked the pastor, like my earlier story about my friend who pastored the megachurch, I asked this pastor, can you give me a tour of the place? He said, sure. He gave me a tour of the place. It did not take long. At the end of it, we're standing in his office, and I said, this seems like a really active church. He said, oh yeah, it really is. We got a lot of stuff going on here. I said, please don't feel insulted by this, but how? Where is everyone? I came in from this direction. Is the town on the other side and I just didn't see it? He said, no, what you drove through is all there is for 30 miles in any direction. So I said, how do you have vibrant ministry here? He said, actually, that's a big part of my story. So I said, please tell me. He said, I've been here for 6 years. For the first 4 years, about all I did was bury church members. One funeral after another after another. He said, 4 years ago, I was sitting at yet another funeral reception. And I'm talking to God by myself while everything's going on around me, going, Lord, why am I here? Did you just call me to literally bury this church one member at a time? Because that's all that's happening. And he said, it occurred to me, we do funeral receptions so well that we've actually gotten pretty good at them. And then he said, it hit me. We do this well. We do this really well. So he said, I went to the funeral director and I told him this. From this point on, whenever anybody dies in this area, you tell them that on the day they bury their loved one, Kurt's Nazarene Church will cook any kind of food they need for any number of people they need in any place that they need. We will cook the food, we will show up, we will serve them, we will clean it up, we will get out of their way, and we will give a grieving family one less thing to worry about on the day that they bury their loved one. He said, since then, we have touched every family in this region. He said, we're standing in his pastor's office. He said, actually, on Monday, I'm clearing out this office. I said, you're not leaving, are you? He goes, no, there's like a janitor's closet down the hallway. That's enough for me. I'm going to move into that. I go, why would you leave this nice office for the janitor's closet? He said, well, as you can tell, this is the only room from which you can see into the sanctuary. I go, yeah. He said, starting Monday, we're going to turn this into a nursery because for the first time in over a decade, our church has babies. Church growth through funeral receptions. Is the title of my next book? No, it's not, because that's theirs. Do not go home and talk to the funeral director. Kurtz is already handling that. So why do I tell you that story? Here's why. If Kurt's Nazarene Church can take the literal physical dying of their congregation members and turn it into a strength with which to bless the community, then God has something in your church that he wants to turn into a strength to bless the community. We need to discover that, and we may find it in the place that we least expect it, just like happened in Kurtz. Now, because of what I do, I spend a lot of time constantly culling through all of the church leadership material that's being written, and there's a lot of it. So I read articles on a regular basis, listen to podcasts, read the latest books. And one of the trends that's kind of been coming out in the last 4 or 5 years, and it's come from multiple sources, is something along these lines. Your church cannot be a great church if the pastor tries to pastor everyone. That's what I've been told, but it's not true. Now, I'm pretty sure that what they intend to say by that is true. What they intend to say by that is, Pastor, if you insist on being the only person who can come up with new ideas and come up with new programs and run it and oversee it and make every single decision, and if you are the funnel through which every single thing has to pass in that church, you will limit the health and vitality of that congregation. If that's what they're intending to say by that, which I believe is what they're intending to say by that, then I agree with what they're intending to say, but I disagree with the way they're saying it. That somehow we have to pastor less and that we shouldn't be pastoring everyone. Here's the truth. Great churches don't happen when we pastor less. And thankfully, we don't have to pastor more. But I think a whole lot of us need to pastor more biblically. So a few years ago, because I've been talking to pastors so much, I thought, I'm going to do a word study in the New Testament on pastor, just to make sure that I'm correct and I'm learning a few things. So I got on my Bible software, and I put in the word pastor, and I got back 0 results. So I put pastoring, and I got back 0 results. I put in pastors, and I got 1 result. And up until 6 or 7 years ago, I'd been in ministry over 35 years at that point. Up until then, I didn't realize pastors, we get 1 mention in the entire New Testament. 1. Now, there are other titles that are mentioned, elders and so on, and a lot of that applies to the work that we do. But the word that we use, pastor, is mentioned once in the New Testament. Ephesians 4, verses 11 and 12, says that Christ gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. We get 1 mention, and in that 1 place where we're mentioned, we have to share the leadership spotlight with 4 other types of leaders. And if you use the APEST acronym, pastor disappears and they replace it with shepherd, and we disappear entirely. Right? We get 1 mention. We're supposed to share the load with 4 other leaders. And in that 1 place, which is the only place we're mentioned, we're given 1 assignment. I have since come to call it the pastoral prime mandate, and it's this: to equip God's people for works of service. We are mandated in Scripture, in the only place where we are mentioned by that specific title, that we are supposed to share the ministry of the church, the leadership of the church, with 4 other gifts, and we are supposed to equip God's people for works of service. Most of us aren't pastoring that way. I was not for years. You know what I was doing? I wasn't pastoring, I was chaplaining. Now, I was a police chaplain for a while. I know a lot of chaplains, and chaplaining is godly work, and we need more chaplains. So if you are a chaplain or you know a chaplain, I am about to way over broadly stereotype the good ministry that you do in order to make a different point, so please bear with me. In general, way over stereotyping it, chaplains bring ministry to people and do ministry for people. If you're a hospital chaplain, you bring ministry to the hospital and you do ministry for them. Military chaplain, police chaplain, school chaplain, you name it. If you're a chaplain, a large part of what you do is to bring ministry to people and do ministry for people. I know it's way more complicated and deeper than that. I'm stereotyping, okay? But I'm making a point. Pastoring, a lot of us are pastoring by bringing ministry to people and doing ministry for people. That's not our calling. We are not called to do ministry for people. We are called to equip God's people for works of service. So with that in mind now, I want to walk you through the 3 essential elements of a healthy, effective church. And I'm going to walk you through how most churches move from ill health to health. All right? The 3 essential elements of a healthy, effective church. Great commandment, great commission, we know those 2, and so now we're going to add to it equipping God's people, or what I call the pastoral prime mandate. Now, when a lot of us show up at a church to begin with, when I showed up at our church 31 years ago, we weren't doing any of those 3, so let's cross them all out. Working from the bottom up, we weren't discipling anybody, they barely liked each other, and their worship services were horrible. So I told you earlier, what did we do for the first 7 years? Worship service, potluck fellowship dinners. Why? To learn to love God and love each other, because what did we do? We did the Great Commandment first. We started by doing the Great Commandment, so let's take the cross off, let's uncross the Great Commandment, right? So we did the Great Commandment. Here's the deal. There's a lot of churches out there that are wondering why they're not growing. They're wondering why they're not being more effective, because they look around and they go, but we have great worship services, and everybody loves and cares for each other. It's the most loving church I know or have ever been a part of, but nobody's coming. Why? Because if all you're doing is the Great Commandment, but you're not doing the Great Commission or equipping God's people, you will have a loving but ineffective church. That's where our church was. We were loving. We got to the point where we were having great worship services, but we realized we've got to reach out to people. So at that point, we added number 2, the Great Commission. We looked around when we were running about 75 people at about 7 years into my current congregation. When I looked around and realized, hey, our worship services are good now, and people are really caring for each other. We've taken care of all of that. We're loving the Lord. We're loving others. Now let's share that with others. And so we started reaching out to the congregation, reaching out to the community. But if you reach out to the community without discipling your people to participate in that with you, here's what you end up with. You end up with overworked pastors and passive members. When our church grew numerically really quickly overnight, we weren't discipling people. We were doing the Great Commandment, great worship services, great fellowship, and then we were doing outreach to the community, but it was mostly the pastoral staff that was doing it. And I wore myself out and I wore our pastoral staff out. And then why did we have so many people leave then all of a sudden after that and we ended up back in our own church again? Because we weren't doing the third one. We were overworking our pastors and we had a worn out staff. And we had a bunch of church people that were transferring from one church to another. They heard we were the cool church now, so they showed up. And on Sunday, we weren't discipling believers. We were entertaining bored Christians. And you can't sustain that. Well, you can build a crowd from that, but you can't sustain a good church from that. So then what did we do? You add equipping God's people. We came back and we said, okay, how do we define a church? How do we have a healthy and successful church without worrying about the numbers, without having numbers attached to it? And that was when I looked at it and said, we need to equip God's people for works of service. The second to last chapter in the book that I'm currently writing, that'll be out in April, the second to last chapter is entitled, Discipleship Fixes Everything. Think about that. Can you name a problem in a church that discipleship doesn't fix? Conflict, discipleship will fix that. Immaturity, discipleship fixes that. Finances, discipleship fixes that. Immorality, discipleship fixes that. You cannot name a problem that happens in a church that discipleship doesn't fix, because that's what we're called to do. The only thing discipleship is not guaranteed to fix is the size of your church. Because it's not a problem to fix. Discipleship fixes problems. And there are some churches, you're going to disciple people and it may not make your church bigger. And in fact, in some churches that have been on a growth spurt, when they reconfigure and really start doing heavy discipleship, sometimes there's a pretty big exodus. And so we started discipling our people and then we started building strength into it. And so now we have a healthy and effective church because that's what we're doing. Okay. With that in mind, let's move along to start thinking about how then do we discover and use what our church does well. Because now that we're talking about it, we're not just talking about discovering what you, pastor, alone do well, but how do we equip God's people and what are we equipping them for and what is your church specifically called to do. There's an old fable about a man who's walking around a farm. And he comes around the side of a barn and there's been an archer shooting arrows into the side of the barn. And on the side of the barn, there are 5 painted targets on the side of the barn. And there's an arrow dead center of each of the painted targets. And he looks at the archer, he looks at the barn and went, wow, you must practice like crazy to hit 5 dead bullseyes. The archer doesn't say anything. He pulls the 5 arrows out, walks around the other side of the barn. There's nothing on that side of the barn except a big old barn door. 5 times in a row, he shoots at the barn door. 5 times, he misses spectacularly. But he doesn't seem worried. Instead, he walks over to the side of the barn where there's a paint can and a paintbrush, and he picks up the paintbrush and he paints a target around where each arrow hit. It's an old fable, but it's a great principle for how we discover what our church does well. I want you to imagine that instead of shooting 5 arrows, the archer shoots 100 arrows. If you start shooting enough arrows, you'll start seeing trends emerge. After you shot 100 arrows, 50 of them may still land randomly, but maybe 25 of them clump up over here, and maybe another 25 clump up over here. So when you start shooting arrows and you start seeing the trends emerge and you start seeing the arrows start grouping, what you do is you get out a big paintbrush and you paint a target around where the arrows tend to be congregating, and you make that your target. So the way to put it is this: do what you know to do, then pay attention to what works and why. Start shooting arrows. What does shooting arrows mean in the church? I don't know. Let's do the Jesus stuff, shall we? Here's the thing. When we talk about the mission of a particular church, we tend to concentrate on the part that makes our church unique, and that may only be 1 or 2% of what you do. Here's the deal. 90% of what Jesus has called my church to do is exactly the same as what Jesus has called your church and every other church on the planet to do. We want to look for the unique part. Some of it may be ego. Some of it may be bad teaching on what we're trying to do here. But let's not start with what makes our church different. Let's start with, let's do what Jesus has called every single church to do. Let's do the Great Commandment. Let's do the Great Commission. Let's equip the saints. And as those things flow through your church, they'll come out differently on the other end than they come out when they flow through my church. C.S. Lewis said, and I'll paraphrase him, that if you start out to try to be creative, it won't work. But if you just start out to do good work, you'll end up being creative. Okay, so just set out to do good work. Start shooting arrows. So when you go back to the church, here's literally how this can practically take place in your congregation starting this week. When you go back home, take a look at what you're planning to do. Are you doing the stuff that Jesus called the church to do? If so, keep doing it. If not, make that adjustment. But now, keep track of everything you do. Okay? Do the things that Jesus called us to do, but now pay attention to what works. Some pastors have actually done this, and I highly recommend it. They actually start a journal, and every single time the church does anything, from a church service to a youth service to feeding the homeless to you visiting the hospital to a home fellowship group, whatever it is, every time your church does something, you make a mark and you say, did we do that well or did we do that poorly? Do that for like 6 months. Then go through your journal, toss the stuff you did badly. Just don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. Take a look at the stuff that you did exceptionally well and ask yourself, what trends are here? What's emerging here? What makes sense here? Where are your arrows congregating? As an example of that, several years ago, about 15 years ago or so, as we were just coming out of that difficult time I was telling you about, we were still trying to figure out what is it that God has called us to do, aside from obviously equipping the saints. And we were losing a lot of people during that period of time. So I actually went to our deacon board one day and I said, I think I figured something out. I said, okay, what? I said, you know how last week we said goodbye to such and such a couple? Yeah. And like 3 weeks before that, we said goodbye to the so-and-so family? Yeah. And the week before that, we said goodbye to such so-and-so? Yeah. We get it. A lot of people are leaving. What's your point? I said, here's the list. And I listed about the last dozen people, families, couples, individuals who had left. And I said, take a look at them. What do 9 of them have in common? And of course, they didn't know what they were looking for, so they didn't know. They're not stupid. I just set them up for that, right? I said, these 9 all left. This one is going to be a missionary. This one went to Bible college. This one was hired as a local youth pastor. This one was hired as a children's minister in their home church. This one was 9 of the 12 were going off to do ministry outside our church. I said, you know what? I think by mistake, we've become an equipping church. We've become a sending church. So my question is, do you want to do that on purpose? Like, we've been sending people off into ministry by mistake. Right? I didn't train them in order for them to leave, but like 4 of them, I had gotten a call from a pastor saying, hey, so-and-so talked to me. Do you have a recommendation? 2 of them were, hey, we need a youth pastor. Do you have anybody who's working with your youth who could maybe come and do that at our small church? And I sent them there. We are still like the recruiting church that people call and go, do you have anybody in your pipeline? I said, here's the deal. If we take people, we're going to take raw material, people who are unequipped, unprepared, undiscipled, and we're going to pour our time, our energy, our passion, our emotions, our teaching, our money, all of these resources into them, and just when they get good enough to start paying us back with the work that they do, some other church is going to want to pay them and they're going to take the paying gig. We're going to lose them as soon as they get to the point where they can pay us back. I said, are we willing to do that? And God bless my deacons. They said, that sounds like kingdom work. Let's do it. So what did we do? We did simply what I put up here already. We did what we knew to do. We did the Jesus stuff. We paid attention to what's working, even though it wasn't what we were intending, and why it's working. And then here's the next thing. After you discover what your church does well, now do it on purpose. We discovered that we were a sending church by mistake. That's where our arrows were clumping. Because Jesus said he'd build his church, and sometimes he does it with us being totally ignorant of how he's doing it. So let's discover how he's doing it. We didn't discover this by looking at the other churches around and going, oh, here's the latest trend, or here's what the big church down the corner does. We looked at it and said, here's what we've been doing. Curtsy, Indiana looked around and went, well, here's what we're good at. And we went and then, oh, here's what we're good at. We'd rather not lose people, but that seems to be what Jesus is doing, so let's get on board with what he's doing. After you discover what your church does well, do it on purpose. The next step then is to do what I call front load the value. Feature what you do well. So once you discover, here's what we do well, now let everybody know. Here's another example. There's a tiny little church in a tiny little town called Ione, California. It's up in Northern California, up in the woods, and the closest anything to Ione is the state men's penitentiary. There are more men in the penitentiary than there are people in Ione. The people in Ione like to refer to them as our friends in the gated community. Because it's a men's penitentiary, the women and children who are connected with those men will move into Ione for months at a time while dad is in the penitentiary so they can visit more often. But it's often women who come with no means of support and kids who are running around making mess in the community because they don't have a positive male influence. And this tiny little church in this tiny little town of Ione, California started having a heart for these kids. They thought, what can we do to help these kids? And so instead of asking the kids and their moms, they did something really smart. They asked the children's teachers, what do the kids need to do better at school? And the overwhelming answer was they need backpacks. They show up with nothing. We give them their books. Within 2 weeks, they're lost or they're destroyed because they don't have something to carry them home in. They need backpacks. So they thought, okay, we're a small church. We can't afford hundreds of backpacks. They got a hold of a ministry that helps small churches, Rural Compassion. It's a division of Convoy of Hope. They said, here's what God is calling us to do. Can you help out? And they said, how many backpacks do you need? And they showed up with a big truck full of backpacks. They had a big Saturday festival where they had face painting and a bounce house, and they did plays from Bible stories, and they did a gospel message. And at the end of it, they gave away backpacks to all of these kids who needed backpacks. This is 7 or 8 years ago, and now every single year, 3 times a year, they do the backpack giveaway at the beginning of school. They give a boots and shoes and winter jacket giveaway at the beginning of winter. They do something else at the beginning of summer. And if you go to their website today or you go to their Facebook page today, bigger than the name of their church is a big banner that says, the church that cares for kids. If you go to Ione, California today and you ask for the church by name, most people won't know what you're talking about. But if you ask them, where's the church that cares for kids? Most of them will know exactly what you're talking about. Now, some people go, well, really, just kids? What about everybody else? They only care for kids? Don't they care for seniors? Don't they care for youth? Don't they care for young adults? Relax. When you do decide to go to that church, if you are a young adult or a young parent or a senior, they basically ask you, do you like working with kids? If your answer is no, they recommend another church for you. If your answer is yes, then they go, awesome, because those kids need big brother and sister examples in their life. They need good, healthy family examples in their life. They need grandmother and grandfather figures in their life. Let's get you connected to help these kids. Again, some people may go, really, they just do the one thing? What about all the other people? Well, here's the deal. They went from doing nothing well to doing one thing exceptionally well. And now that's what they're about. Well, what about the other folks? Well, you know what? The body of Christ is wide and varied. And even in a small town like Ione, there are other churches taking care of other people. They've discovered that they are the left foot, big toe, toenail on the body of Christ, and that's what they're going to do. And there's another church somewhere else that's the finger, and there's another church somewhere else that's a nose, and there's another church somewhere else that's one of the hairs on the head. Everybody's got their own role. They're just taking care of their own business that God gave them to do. And they're declaring it. This is who we are. So, let's review it again really quickly. Do what you know Jesus has called every church to do. Pay attention to the way that works in your own church. The stuff that doesn't work, don't worry about it. Take a look at the stuff that does work and ask, what does it have in common? And now do that on purpose. And then as you start doing that on purpose, let everybody know this is what our church is about. Now, the question then becomes, okay, how do we get to the point where we're just doing that thing? Because we're doing a whole lot of stuff right now. And how do we start narrowing it down? Here's how. People who live in really big cities, who pay really high rents and have really small closets, have a thing for their clothes in their closet that they call the closet rule. The closet rule is simply this: you don't put a new garment into your closet until you take an old garment out of your closet. That's it. I told this once to a conference of small church pastors several years ago, and a pastor's wife came to me afterwards, and she said, I actually have exactly the same rule for the RV, and I call it the RV rule. My husband is not allowed to put a new toy in the RV until he's taken an old toy out of the RV. Whichever one you want to use, go for it. But the closet rule states you can't put something new in until you've taken something old out. What often happens, and what I did for years, is I'd come to a conference like this. I'd hear of a great idea or two, and I'd go, oh, that's it. That's going to be awesome. I'd take it to the church, and we'd try it. It got to the point where they dreaded every time I went to a conference. They'd go, what book did Pastor read now? And it wasn't that they didn't want to do it. It's that they were exhausted. I just kept adding stuff to the closet. They were overwhelmed. We need to start removing stuff from our closet. And a lot of our churches, we need a 2-for-1 sale. We're trying to do too much. Churches in America are overprogrammed, and small churches especially are way overprogrammed. We are all trying to do too many things that Jesus isn't calling us to do. And the main reason usually is one of two reasons. Either because the big churches do all these programs, so as I said earlier, we try to do them all but smaller, and we end up doing them all but badly. Or secondly, that's just traditionally what was done here, and so we keep going. So we get to the point where we've got all this stuff because over the years, we keep adding programs and ministries, and nobody has the heart to stop them. So how do we decide which ministries we're going to stop doing? Here are two simple questions that every pastor needs to ask at least annually. Here they are. What does your church do well that you'd like to do more of? And what does your church do poorly that you'd like to do less of? That's all. You notice I'm not asking you, hey, what's the latest trend in your neighborhood? No. You're looking at your own DNA. What are you currently doing well? Wouldn't it be great to do more of the stuff you're already doing well? Wouldn't it be great to allocate resources into something that you're already doing well? You know it'll succeed because you're already doing it well. But those resources have to be allocated from somewhere else. So where do we take them from? How about if we take them from the things we're not doing so well? This is a good question to start with. What do we do well that we'd like to do more of? What do we do poorly that we'd like to do less of? And even for those people who are in ministries that are doing poorly, we're not saying that ministry is not important. We're not saying it's not valid. We're just saying we're just not doing it well lately. Let's reallocate. Now, I know, because I'm a small church pastor, of everything I've said so far, this just caused shivers of fear in the hearts of small church pastors more than anything else I've said. The idea of walking up to someone who's been overseeing a beloved ministry for decades and telling them we're taking all the stuff that we're putting into that ministry and we're going to reallocate it over here. How do I navigate through that conversation without getting my head handed to me? Right? So let's help you with that, hopefully, okay? We need to move out of a destination mindset and into what's called a process orientation. Out of a destination mindset and into a process orientation. Most churches are built and most church people have a destination mindset. I'm going to stereotype it to make my point. So we get a picture of, we want to build a church. So we buy a piece of land, we build the building, we bolt the pews to the floor, we put the denominational sign out front, we put a big spire or a cross on the front of it, we put the pews in the back, we put the hymn books in the back of the pews, we put a big old pulpit on the platform with a plaque on the side of it that says, don't you dare get rid of this pulpit until everybody in the family who donated it has died. And it takes so much time, so much effort, so much money, so much hassle to get to that destination that when we finally get to that destination, we go, we have the church that we pictured in our minds. When you arrive at a destination, what do you typically stop doing? You stop moving because you arrived. And so a lot of our churches get to this destination And then a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades go by, and we look around and go, how did we lose touch with the community? Well, because they kept moving and you froze in place. You arrived at your destination and you stayed. And I've been in some of your churches. Some of you haven't dusted the fake plants on your stage in a decade. I checked first. They don't have any, so we're good. I always check before I use that illustration. Sometimes I'm not able to use it, right? That's the destination mindset, and too many of us have that. And I understand why, because there's a comfort level with a destination. I'm familiar with this. I know these songs, I know this place, I know this particular thing. There's a comfort level with that. And I am not the one who says you got to take people out of their comfort level. No, I like my comfort zone. Do not take me out of my comfort zone. I'm happy there. It is not healthy to constantly be upending people's comfort zones. People need a safe landing place, especially when you're changing a lot. But there's a way to give them a comfort zone that isn't static. And that is the next section of it, right? Not a destination mindset, but a process orientation. So let's talk through what a process orientation is. I want you to imagine that you want to run a marathon. And there's a high school near you, and there's a 1/4-mile track behind the high school. So you buy all new jogging gear, and you're going to go out there and you're going to run around that 1/4-mile track 4 or 5 times to get warmed up this first time doing it. It's been a few years, but you know you can do it. And one time around and you are on the ground. But the next morning you're determined, you get up and you do it again, and it's a little bit better. The next morning a little bit better. And a few weeks goes by, maybe a few months goes by, and every day you were going out there and you were just going around that track over and over and over. And I want you to take a look at my finger here, because my finger is describing to you something that's very important. This is a process. A process has 2 ingredients as demonstrated by my finger right now. The 2 ingredients of a process are motion and consistency. Motion and consistency. A process has motion and consistency, okay? My finger is always moving, but you're not wondering where it's going to go next, are you? Because of the consistency. That's not what we do when we change in churches. Here's what we usually do. We haven't changed anything in a decade. We go to a conference or read a book and we go, oh, we need to do this. And we change from here to here. And then we change later from here to here. And then we see another new idea and we change from here to here. And everybody goes, what are you doing here? And it doesn't make any sense to people because there's no process to the change. But if you can come up with a process for change, here's what happens. You can replace people's comfort zone from the destination to the process. I can be comfortable with this because I understand this, right? That's something I can be comfortable with. If you show me the process, I can be comfortable with that. I don't have to insist on a destination anymore because you've given me a process that makes sense and that I can have some comfort with, okay? Here's the thing. We think that churches don't like change. That's actually not true. Churches can handle change, but they don't like to be surprised. This is hugely important for us to understand. Churches are not change averse. Okay? The gospel is about change. From darkness to life, from death to life. Right? It's also about consistency because we serve the God who's the same yesterday, today, and forever, as found in the pages of the book whose newest entries are 2,000 years old. So there's a lot of consistency and there's a lot of change. That's the process. Change and consistency is the gospel. So if we give them a process that they can understand, they can handle change because they're not surprised. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you our church's process. You can take it, you can leave it, you can edit it. I'm just giving it to you as an example. Our church's process is really simple. We are always improving our least effective ministry, and we are always improving the least effective part of our building. End of sentence. That's our entire process. We are always, and I mean always, improving our least effective ministry. We never are without a ministry under construction. Always. And we are always improving the least effective part of our building. Always, always, always. Let me give you an example of that. Several years ago, we had a woman who was overseeing our kids ministry department. Only a handful of kids in it. We're a small church. At the beginning of the summer, she told me by the end of the summer, she wasn't going to be able to do it anymore. We didn't have anybody in our pipeline at that time who could take over for her. She had 2 helpers who were fairly inconsistent and weren't ready to step up to lead. At the time, we were running an internship program. Part of our understanding of training them up and sending them out was, hey, let's bring some interns in to do that. And we knew that we had a 18-year-old girl who was coming in September who was going to be an intern, and we knew that her calling was for children's ministry. But she'd never run a children's ministry before. She'd helped out at her own church. So I realized that's all I was going to have. So I had the summer to figure out how to redesign our children's ministries department so that it could be run by an 18-year-old girl who'd never done it before. Welcome to small church pastoring. Because most of you wish you at least had an 18-year-old girl who was willing, because, right, most of us don't even have that, right? So I looked at our kids' ministries, and we were doing 5 things: Sunday morning, Wednesday night, VBS, trunk or treat, and one other thing, okay? 5 things. And I said, okay, let's put them in order of priority, most important to least important. Most important was Sunday morning, and then the others. And then I asked myself, what would happen if we stopped doing those 4 things and only did this one thing? What if we took all of the time, resources, energy, people that we were pouring into 5 things and poured them all into one thing? I ran it by our 2 volunteers who'd been helping out. And their first question was, are we allowed to do that? I said, well, I'm the pastor and I'm proposing it, so I'm going to imagine, yes, we're allowed to do that. They said, so we can take all the time we've been putting into 5 things, we can put into 1, yeah. All the ideas we come up with that we're trying to spread thinly over 5 things, we can put into 1, yeah. All the stuff we can go into 1, yeah. They said, that'd be awesome. At that point, they were volunteering 1 month on, 1 month off for kids on Sunday morning because they were doing all those other 4 things. Here's the deal. In a big church, when they have 5 major things that they do with the kids, you have an entirely different team for each of the 5. Nobody's getting worn out. But in a small church, if you're trying to do 5 major things for kids, the same people are doing all 5 and you're wearing them out. So we stopped doing all of those. This is like 5, 6, 7 years ago. The only thing we do for kids still today is Sunday morning. But we do Sunday morning so much better than we used to because all of the resources are there. At some point or another, will we add something? Sure, when our closet gets bigger. What's the closet getting bigger? When we have more kids, when we have more leaders, when we're better trained, when there's a need that what we need to meet. There's all kinds of ways that our closet will get bigger. But so far, that's what we do because that's what we need. So take a look at it and ask yourself, what are we doing? How can we trim that back? How can we reallocate resources? And we did that because we have a process that says we're always improving our least effective ministry. That summer, our least effective ministry was about to be kids ministry. So let's figure out how to improve it. And then after we figured that and we put it in, we looked at the room they were meeting in and realized that room is now no longer adequate for all the great ideas they've got, so let's fix the room. So we improved the least effective part of our building. Everybody who comes to our church knows that's part of the culture of our church now. I don't even repeat it anymore because it's now a part of the unwritten set of rules that governs everything we do, is that there's always a ministry under construction and there's always a part of the building under construction. The comfort level now comes not with we do ministry this way, destination. The comfort level now comes with we do ministry through this process. And that process helps people understand it. Now, if you set up a process, then pastors and church leaders, you then need to be faithful to that process. You can't put in your pet project ahead of the system. The process only works if you work the process. You've got to be consistent and have integrity with it, okay? And then as part of that, as we're working through the process, let me give you this piece. We need to give leaders time to ponder big decisions. A big part of the way we do change, again, is we hear, and then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And like I said, churches can handle change, but we need to reduce surprise. So here's one of the ways in our church that we reduce surprise. Like I said earlier, when I came to our church 31 years ago, in the previous 10 years, they'd had 5 different pastors. And one of the board members came to me shortly after I'd started, and he said, you know, Pastor, can I run something by you? I'm not trying to be controlling, but I've got an idea that I think will help you and help us. I said, sure. He said, for 5 pastors in a row, we've had pastors who have come in and they've had all these great ideas, but they just go ahead and do them. And like, we walked in once and one of them had moved the entire audio system and had put it in a booth because he was an old radio guy, and to him the soundboard should be in a booth. And so literally our sound guy is sitting outside in front of the booth, having to reach into the booth behind him to adjust the audio because he couldn't hear. He wasn't in the room. He said he built that without asking us, and people asked us, why did you do that? And we had to say, we don't know. So he said, all I'm asking is, Pastor, would you include us in the major decisions? We want to help you, and we will help you. This is not a controlling thing. We just want to participate. And God bless them, that they've stayed true to that. So here's what I promised. I told them this. I will never present a big idea and ask you to make a decision about it in the meeting in which I presented it. I'll always give you at least one meeting's notice before you need to make a final decision about it. So here's how it worked once. At about the 7 or 8 year point, when the church was finally beginning to get healthy and we're beginning to realize we can reach out into our community, I started to realize our church has a bad name in our community because 5 pastors in 10 years, 4 of them left under a cloud. 1 of them left because he married the church secretary after divorcing his wife. It was a whole big mess. So our church had a bad name in the community. So I thought we need to change our church name. So I presented it to our board, and the rule was I present it to you, we pray about it, we don't even talk about it. You take it home, you pray about it and think about it until the next board meeting. So I presented this idea. We need to change our church name. Here's why. Go home. Pray, go home. Next month, they come back. At the end of the meeting, I say, okay, I'll present it to you again. What are you thinking about it? The longest standing, most respected member of the church board said, I'll tell you exactly what I thought when you said that last week. Nobody's changing the name of my church. And oh boy. He said, but you know what? We went on vacation since the last meeting. I said, yeah, I saw you gone for the last 2 Sundays. He said, yeah. On the first Sunday, we were, at this place on vacation, and we're looking for a church to go to on Sunday. And my wife is reading off the names of local churches, and she read one local church name, and I went, I don't want to go there. That sounds like some dull, dry, boring old church. And she looked at me and she said, Al, that's exactly the same name as our church. Now, this is one of those pastor stories that people tell and go, how does a deacon forget the name of his church, dude? Come on, you're just making that up, right? No, I'm not. It was one of those things where everybody just called the church by its initials, right? And he hadn't called the church by its name in forever. It was just the initials, right? And he hadn't thought about it, and it was out of context and everything else. And in fact, this is how I can guarantee that it's true. I wrote this story in my second book, Small Church Essentials. My publisher, Moody, was the only thing they questioned was, that story, did it actually happen? I said, yeah, it did. They said, the guy it happened to, can you get a hold of him? I said, yeah, he still goes to the church. They said, great. Take it exactly as it's written in the book. Copy it into a letter format with a place on the bottom where he and you can both sign that it's true and send it to us. Honest. So today, at Moody Publishers headquarters in Chicago, there is a file folder with a letter stating that this story actually happened, signed by the guy it happened to. All right? So what's my point? If in the first meeting I had said, I want to change the church name, what do you think? He'd have gone, nobody's changing the name of my church, and it would have been dead. But here's the deal. I hadn't presented that to them until I'd been thinking and praying about it for months. When I first thought of the idea, it kind of scared me too. And we come up with these ideas, and the Lord gives us days, weeks, months to think, to ponder, to wonder, to explore, to ask questions, to do research, until we finally go, that's a great idea. We ought to do that. And then we present it to our church leaders, and if they're not on board in 20 minutes, they're dragging their heels. God gives us the gift of time. Let's give them the gift of time. If we give people the gift of time, they will come along for really big changes far more often than we give them credit for, especially if it matches the process. So give leaders time to ponder big decisions. And then let me conclude with one last story before we break for lunch. When I first started doing this ministry, a friend of mine came to me and he said, I've just read this book and there's a chapter in it that I think would really help with, that really kind of matches what I hear you want to do. And he gave me the book. It's about this thick. I said, are you giving me a gift or homework? And the book is called D-Day. It's written by Stephen Ambrose. Stephen Ambrose is most famous for having written Band of Brothers. And in this, there's a chapter that talks about when he was a young reporter in the 1960s, he had the chance to interview Dwight Eisenhower about D-Day. He was doing an article for a magazine. And after interviewing Eisenhower, the commander of the Allied forces on D-Day, after interviewing Eisenhower, he said, Eisenhower asked him, so where are you going next? He said, I'm going to New Orleans. And Eisenhower said, oh, are you going to talk to Andrew Jackson Higgins? And he said, no, Higgins died a couple months ago, I think, and why would I talk to Higgins about D-Day anyway? And Dwight Eisenhower said, oh, that's too bad. Andrew Jackson Higgins won World War II for us. Anybody know who Andrew Jackson Higgins is? Yeah, me either. Let me tell you. Andrew Jackson Higgins was a boat builder in New Orleans. He had an idea for a small boat that he thought the Department of Navy could use, so he brought it to them. They looked at it and said, it's not big enough. We need battleships, destroyers. We got to get across the Pacific, the Atlantic, the English Channel. We can't use small boats. He said, I think you're going to need it. They said, nah. He brought it back a second time. He brought it back a third time, rejected 3 times. D-Day starts getting closer, and as they're putting everything together, they realize in order to get all the troops there, they're going to have to put them on these, ships and so on. But these ships are only going to get to about a mile off the sand. And in order to get them off the big ships and onto the sand a mile away, they're going to need a whole bunch of small boats. But D-Day was really close, and D-Day had a really tight window. And they didn't know what to do, so they did the unprecedented. They sent letters to every boat builder in the country saying, here's what we need. Can anybody help us with this? And Andrew Jackson Higgins went, ahem. He showed them his drawing again, and they went, it's perfect. And he went, I know. And then they said, but it's too tight. I don't know if we can get the supplies, if we can get the factories retrofitted. How are we going to do this in time? He said, don't worry about it. I knew you'd need it. I bought over half the materials, and I've begun to retrofit my factories already. Mic drop, right? Now, you may not have heard his name before, but if you've ever seen a World War II movie that has D-Day in it at all, you know his work. Because while they gave this boat a random series of letters of numbers, the only thing anybody has ever called these boats are Higgins boats, after Andrew Jackson Higgins. Higgins boat, flat bottom, tall high sides, tall front, 20 to 40 troops, go in, hit the sand, the front drops, and a bunch of boys run into hell on earth and save the world that day. And more boots were put on the ground through Higgins boats than all other landing craft combined. Small matters. He knew small mattered even when nobody else knew small mattered, and he kept doing the small because he knew it. There may be times when your voice feels like a voice speaking into the wind and nobody's paying attention, but I want to encourage you, keep doing the small because we need you. There's no way to imagine what it must have been like on that day. But I wonder if there were some Higgins boat commanders who were in that boat getting closer and closer to the sand, looking back at a battleship and going, man, I wish I was the captain of the battleship. Looking back at a destroyer and thinking, I heard the admiral's on that destroyer. I'd be a better admiral than that guy. Instead, I'm stuck on this tiny little Higgins boat with everybody shooting at us. But the Higgins boat commander could do something that day that the captain and the admiral could not do. Because before he got into that boat with the rest of his troops that day, he went around to every troop under his command and he asked for their letters to home. And then he added his own letter to home and he put it in the strong box by his bunk. And if he made it through the day, he went back and he pulled them out and he gave the letters back to the survivors, usually only about half. And with the other letters, he was able to add his own note. I knew your son, your husband, your father, your brother. I fought alongside him. He loved you. He showed us your picture all the time. And while I cannot understand the depth of your loss, I can tell you that I do share it because I miss him too. We get to do that. In small churches, we get to do that. Don't ever shortchange that, because it changes the world. You see, on that day, we needed everybody. We needed the small landing craft, and while the small landing craft were going in, the destroyers behind were lofting missiles, bombs overhead to the soft inland. Do you know that day 2 was shockingly easy compared to what they thought it would be because of what the big ships had done by softening that next section for those who were on the ground? And then after several days, they're in there and they're trying to figure their way out through France. Where are we? Then the paratroopers come along and drop supplies. And so in the body of Christ, we have the small churches. We have the big churches providing big munitions. And occasionally we have this, a parachute drop from parachurch organizations that come in and drop supplies just when you need it. That's what I am to you today. I'm a parachute drop of supplies just when you need it. Provided by Indiana Ministries Church of God. Who do we leave out of this and make the day a success? Nobody. You take any ingredient out and that day fails. But Christ has every ingredient in exactly the place that he needs it to be. And I want to say this closing word before we go to lunch to you, my fellow Higgins boat commanders, my fellow small church pastors. Don't ever let anybody tell you that what you do doesn't matter. Don't ever look into that mirror and wonder if what you do matters. Because what you do is essential. And I am proud to be in your company. Thank you.
Dr. Karl Addison, make your way forward. You know, we have been blessed today, amen? And just think, if you were participating in Thrive, you could spend a whole nother day with Karl Vaters in a small setting, in a room full with lots of stuff to eat, good friends, good brothers and sisters, get a chance to ask some questions. And but you need to be part of Thrive. And we are blessed to have a key staff member here. There you are. Dr. Karl Addison, who has that passion. His passion is for you. As a matter of fact, when I get a brother or sister calling me up and I want to connect them with somebody that can help, walk alongside, pray, this is the man that I call. And he is gifted, he and Valerie, to do just that. He is perfect as a staff member to lead our Thrive effort. And we are blessed to have the resources that we have to pour into you. And Karl, that's an accurate word, isn't it? We can pour into your life to help you if you're hurting, to make you stronger, to equip you. And we all need to be around brothers and sisters that can walk with us and speak into our life. Thrive is all that and more. So I want to turn the mic over to Karl. He's going to talk more about that. And then following that, don't leave, because Janine from our staff, Janine Leidy, will be coming up and offering some key instructions for lunch and praying for that lunch. Karl, thank you.
Well, knowing that you don't get lunch instructions till after I'm finished brings me great comfort. So much to take away so far today, right? I hope the only thing that you take away isn't this, the combination of that guy that Karl talked about earlier, that guy, and maybe there's another church for you. If you put those two together, you miss the whole point. What we really want to try to accomplish with the next couple of minutes is to communicate to you a little bit about what the Thriving in Ministry Initiative is. And honestly, it is a a really practical demonstration of what Karl concluded with, and saying that you matter. What you do is valuable. We want to come alongside you. We want to help you thrive in what you're doing. We want you to make that move from surviving to thriving, and then from thriving to thriving even more. And no matter where you are in your ministry journey, Thrive has something that can be absolutely transformational for you. 5 years ago, over in the crossings room, we were able to announce that we had received a $653,300 grant from the Lilly Endowment to fund Thriving in Ministry for the next 5 years. And it has been one of the pieces of ministry that has been incredibly impactful. And other regions look on us and say, man, we wish we had that. And so I want you to just kind of view this video for the next couple of minutes, so that you just get a feel for the high impact kind of ministry that is available to you as a part of Indiana Ministries.
Thrive for me has been just a huge impact in my ministry and my life.
Thrive's been a great opportunity for me to make friends who are pastors and move beyond some of the traditional ways of talking about our lives based on numbers and things, and actually get to hear what's happening in each other's hearts.
I have been a part of the Thrive program for about 1.5 years now. One of the ways Thrive has been an encouragement to me is through the connection with other pastors. And whether it is simply sharing about our common experiences in ministry or troubleshooting a challenge together, that opportunity to network and connect and experience community makes me a better pastor.
The relationships that I have formed with those that I have mentored over the last several years have just become some really powerful relationships in my life. Ministry is so easy to get isolated and feel alone, and I'm so grateful that for Indiana pastors that there's something that can fill that gap.
I'd been searching for a female pastor mentor for a while, and so having someone like Mary Ellen, who is toward the end of her ministry cycle, is amazing, just because there's so much life that she's lived and experienced that she's been able to just really pour into me. And as someone who's, fairly new to ministry, it's just nice to have a woman who understands the dynamics of what it looks like.
Thrive has just bolstered our ministry. It's given me new tools to care for others. It's given me a replenishment in my own spirit so that I can pour better into other people's spirits. Thrive has even provided a model for mentoring and coaching, and I think even discipleship that we're able to use with our folks in our congregation. I'm really hoping that over time, everybody in our congregation will be receiving coaching the way that I am in Thrive, and the way that I'm able to contribute through Thrive.
The Thrive Retreat that happens in the early part of every year. When Andrew and I hang that on our calendar, we know that it's going to be one of our favorite weekends of the year. The hotel's awesome, the food is wonderful, the relationships, the game night, the content, it's just been one of our favorite weekends every year of the last couple of years.
The retreats that we've had, they've been very much life-giving, especially in seasons where it can be very tiring and not getting the rest that we need. Thrive has made it very intentional to make sure that during our retreats that we're having time of fun and fellowship, but also that we're spending time getting just poured into.
One other way that Thrive has been a tremendous blessing to me is through the financial support they provide for counseling. Almost 2 years ago, I knew that my dad's health was declining, and it was very clear that he may not be with us much longer. He passed away in April of 22. And so I started going into counseling because I knew, on top of pastoral ministry, that I'm probably going to have some of my own grief to walk through. And for at least the last year, Thrive has paid for my counseling services, and it has been a tremendous financial blessing to me. But it has also allowed me to prioritize my own mental health.
We have an opportunity with this grant that allows us to get really poured into. I think that's the biggest thing. And the thing that I would say for anyone who's thinking about doing Thrive is to just do it.
If you need to not be alone in ministry anymore, If you need somebody to be caring for you, pastor, you need to come be a part of Thrive. If you need to get to share care for other pastors, you need to be a part of Thrive.
I want to encourage you to take that step outside of your comfort zone. What that might mean, or at least what it meant for me, was simply humbly acknowledging that sometimes I need help and that that's okay. That sometimes the pastor needs pastored. I want to encourage you to take that step and see how Thrive can benefit you and make you a better pastor.
It's the thing you need to say yes to.
If you're out there and you're not involved in Thrive, I want to encourage you to do so. I promise you, it'll be life-changing.
If you'd like to know a little bit more about the process, the QR code on the screen will take you to the right spot. A couple of things to add to that piece, though, as you consider your engagement. One of the really awesome pieces of this is that we were invited to apply for a sustainability grant from Lilly Endowment. As you might have done the math, at the end of 2023, our original grant period expires, so that's at the end of the 5-year process. But we were invited to write for another grant, and Lilly has awarded us enough money again to continue the process between what we will roll over and what we'll be receiving in this next grant period over the next 5 years. We actually are going to have more money to start 2024 with than we did back in 2019 when we first got started. So that's a really exciting thing to announce to you today that we are receiving that sustainability grant, which in turn means that there'll be a few cosmetic kinds of changes to the Thriving in Ministry endeavor. One of which might include some smaller fees for registration pieces, because we're compelled by our agreement now to generate some income on our part. Our board of directors has stepped up and has made our financial burden on matching the money that we need incredibly easy. And if you see one of our board of directors, thank them for that, because they said yes to my request to do that, because they believe in you, they care about you, they want to come alongside you, because that's what we do at Indiana Ministries. We want to see pastors thrive, because we also know that thriving pastors are the people that lead thriving churches. Let me just kind of sum this up by saying to you that there are 4 foundational pieces about which we are deeply passionate. One of them is that we want to provide every participant with a mentor or an exemplar, somebody that comes alongside them. One of the pieces of research that we've been able to do indicates that almost every single person in ministry who reports that they really feel like they're flourishing in ministry has that kind of person in their life. It just doesn't happen in isolation. In fact, doing ministry in isolation is dangerous. We want you to be engaged with other people. So that mentoring relationship is cornerstone number 1. Cornerstone number 2 is the whole concept of peer connections. We need each other. We learn from each other. We grow together. We pray for each other. We support each other. And it just, again, doing ministry alone is just not a healthy thing. We want to invite you into this process. The third of those pieces that we really are passionate about is the whole idea of spiritual formation. You don't do ministry well over the long haul if you're not walking with Jesus in a way that's life-giving. If you're not thriving in that relationship, then we want to come alongside and make sure that you have every opportunity to access things like spiritual direction and spiritual retreats and just some other resources that will help you as you grow in your journey with Jesus. And then that last cornerstone is what we call healthy living resources, where, as you heard Anthony perhaps mention, the counseling availability. But there's so many other pieces that, because of this tremendous generosity that we've been recipients of, we can provide for you so that you can tailor-make your own thriving in ministry plan, so that you can walk through this process, discover what it is that will help you thrive, have people come alongside you to pour into you, to consider that. And by the way, some of you might need to be considering not just being on the receiving end of that, but on the pouring into end. Some of you need to consider stepping up and being someone that is mentoring other people. And we actually have some folks that are doing both because there's a lot of strength and continuing to be mentored as you begin to mentor other people. So many opportunities for you to be enriched in ministry, to grow and develop and discover more and more about who you are and how you can not only thrive in your ministry, but then allow that to have that ripple effect into the congregation that you're serving. Strategically located on the way to the bathroom is a table where you might be able to interact with Crystal Snyder, our ministry assistant, who actually is the one that makes this whole thing work. Thank her when you go by. She has 3 QR codes laying on the table where you can get a brochure, you can find an application, and she told me what the other one was for, but who knows? She'll fix you up. But stop by the table, grab me, and then one last thing: if you have been a part of Thrive, why don't you just stand up real quickly so other people might see who you are and ask you questions? All right? Yeah. So if you haven't been a part of it, find some of these folks that are standing around the room and let them tell you how much it's meant to them and how much impact it's had on their lives and ministries. But we'd love to include you. And if you had done it before, you could come tomorrow and you could play top golf with us tonight, but you didn't. So that's supposed to be motivating you. Thank you so much.